In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the valve cover gasket and the spark plug tube seals on this Jeep Wrangler with a 2.4 liter engine. Let's get started. Keep in mind for this procedure we do have to remove the air intake, so it is possible that you will also need intake gaskets to go with this. Let's get started. From underneath you can see where the radiator petcock is. It's towards the driver's side at the bottom of the radiator. Looks like we have some sort of wire tie here, so I'm going to loosen it up the rest of the way. Well, I guess I have to take this off first, but you would want to turn it counterclockwise and let the coolant drain. Okay, there we go. Let's get that out of there. I'm not going to remove this all the way. I'm going to make sure it stays in here. And now let's go to the top, open up the radiator cap so air can come in as this drains. Otherwise it'll pull a vacuum and it's going to drain very, very slowly. Remove the radiator cap. There we go. Remove it. Now it's going to drain a lot faster, and we'll just keep working while this continues draining. Next, we have to remove this air box. I'm going to pull it right off of the throttle body side so that this piece of hose here, this intake tubing, can come off with it and just clear it out of the way. To do that, we need an 8mm socket to loosen up this clamp. Once you loosen it up a little bit, you should be able to pull this right up and off. There is a vacuum hose here. Mine is broken, so if yours isn't, disconnect it off of the air box only, and then you should be able to pull it right out of the way. Next, I want to disconnect the throttle body. To do that, I'm going to unplug these two electrical connectors. And this one at the top has a red locking tab up on top. Then you can press the connector, pull it aside, and then there are three 10mm bolts that we have to remove. I'm going to start with this one at the bottom here. Remove all three. Now you can set this aside. The throttle cable, I'm going to leave attached to it. I'm just going to basically push it out of the way on the side where it's not going to interfere with my work. I don't want to mess with this bracket, so I'm just going to pull it aside. To do that, I need to remove this vacuum hose. That gives me space to pull this out of the way. Next, I'm going to disconnect the upper radiator hose. I'm going to pull it off of this water neck here. And then I'm going to pull the water neck off so we can get to one of the intake bolts. Grab some pliers, squeeze the clamp, pull the clamp up. There shouldn't be any coolant in this since we already drained it. You can very gently give this a twist if it's stuck. Break that free, pull the hose up. Now take a 13mm socket. If you have a swivel socket, that's even better, so you can fit it here, but if you don't, it should still fit, just with a longer extension. Break these free. Okay, pull this out of here. Below the intake here, you'll see these lines. These two are evap lines, and then your main fuel line. I'm going to remove these brackets off of the intake. They have a 10mm bolt underneath on each of these clamps here, each of these brackets, and doing this will give me a little bit extra wiggle room. Pull both off. There we go. Just because we're going to have a lot of similar bolts coming up, I'm going to thread these back in so I don't mistake where they go or accidentally lose them. Now there are 5 10mm headed bolts that hold this intake on. They are very difficult to see. Basically, there's one on each end, then one in between each runner. It basically goes top, bottom, top, bottom, top. That's it. Just 5 of them, 10mm in size. Let's break them all free and remove them. I'm going to try to start with the 2 outermost bolts and leave the center one for last. Next, I'm going to pull off the dipstick tube bolt so that I can pull it further back. I don't want to bend it. It could break. So in order to give myself more space, let's pull that dipstick retainer off. All right, so if you look really close right here, I'm looking from the driver's side. This is the driver's side fender right here. That nut right there, 13 millimeter in size, holds a couple ground cables as well as the bracket for the dipstick tube. What you can also see in this shot, right up there, is the last 10 millimeter headed bolt for the intake. So as you can see, once we get that off, we have a clear shot at the 10 millimeter headed bolt. Having said that, let's get all this out. Let's get these off of there. Now we'll need a deep 13 millimeter socket to break free that stud, which acts as the bolt for the bracket for that dipstick tube. Okay, take that off. Now we should be able to push this back a little bit. Perfect. Okay, we're on that last bolt. All right, the whole intake moved. I can pull that out. There we go. I'm going to pull this PCV hose off of here so that I can have enough clearance to pull this wiring harness up. I'm going to pop the wiring harness off of these retainers. There's one here and one a little bit further back. Kind of hard to see. There we go. This lets us push it back a little bit further. This wire here should also have a couple retainers. Mine are already popped off. They kind of sneak up in there. They're broken, so there's nothing I can do about that. If yours are still there, pop them off. Now let's remove the ignition coil pack as well as the 4 spark plug wires. I'm just going to unbolt this and then pull everything off. I'm going to leave these connected. There isn't a good reason for me to disconnect them. So I'm going to just take them off as an assembly. Use a 10 millimeter socket and remove all 4 of these bolts. With those off, pull the spark plug wires up and out, and remove this whole unit. Once you remove it, you should be able to flip it around, and on the back side here, there's a wiring harness. Press in on the locking tab, the red tab. That should allow you to remove the electrical connector, unplug it, set this aside. Towards the back of the engine and the valve cover here, we're going to have to pry up this entire wiring harness so it can pop off of its retainers, which are basically just going to be these studs here. There we go. There's a ground strap here also. Be careful of that so you don't break it, especially if it's slightly corroded. We're going to have to work around all these wires at the back here, but it does look like you can push them pretty far out of the way. So that's good. We have to access a bolt right here, and then these 2 studs on the side. I don't think there should be a problem with the way I have the wires positioned, but whatever you do, just make sure you don't pull on them too hard or break them by accident. I would like to get the wiring harness that runs across the top of the engine off. I don't have enough slack in it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically follow it on this side. It only has 3 connectors that are still plugged in here, and then I'm going to unplug it right here and basically just flip the whole thing over. It is definitely worth it to get those unplugged and get it completely out of the way. Like I said, follow the harness. You'll see an oil pressure sensor here. This locking tab is a little bit stuck, so I'm going to grab a pocket screwdriver to help me out, just to pry this thing up. There we go. Now we can unplug it. Down here, there's another little connector for the crank position sensor. Pry that locking tab back. Unplug this as well. The wiring harness is secured on the side of the engine block. Try to gently pry this retainer off. These do break often, so if it breaks, we'll have to secure it in a different way. There we go. Get this up and off. Continue following the harness and get it off the timing cover. And up here, another connector. This one's supposed to have a lock on it, but the lock is missing, so I'm just going to unplug it. Now you can flip this up, and if you want to, you can unplug this connector for the coolant temp sensor. Now you can really get this out of your way. Now grab an 8 millimeter socket, remove all the bolts that hold on this valve cover. I'm going to start from the outer ones, work my way towards the middle. So I'll get these two off, the ones in the back, and then the two in the center. You'll need a deep socket for these as they're studs. These I have to get by hand just because my power tool won't fit in here. Okay, all we have left is the three in the middle. Now pry up on the valve cover, and there we go. You should be able to remove it. I have to move all those wires in the back here, so it's not really letting it pop up, but oh, there it is. All right. Let's replace the valve cover gasket. Pull up on the old one. There's some RTV here. It actually has to be reinstalled. I'll show you that in a little bit. Get this one off, and then we'll get the spark plug tube seals peeled off of here. You can use a little pick or screwdriver to help you get them out if you can't. At this point, it is important to clean the valve cover. If you have a lot of oil buildup everywhere, wipe it off. Make sure you use something that's not going to leave a lot of debris behind, such as a paper towel that will leave a bunch of lint. Also, if the top of it was very dirty from oil leaks, clean it off. I already somewhat degreased it. Mine did have some oil buildup on it. But now that I have the gaskets off, I'm going to focus on the ridges or the cutouts where the gaskets go. I'm going to clean them off with some brake parts cleaner, just kind of spray it in the area, and then I'll use some compressed air and blow the brake parts cleaner off because I don't want to leave that in here. Grab the new gasket and try to lay it flat in whichever direction you think it needs to go. This should be molded to the valve cover, so you're going to want to find how this molding wants to sit on here. Otherwise, it will not line up. You can see right here on this divot where the camshaft goes through, or where it's capped off. You're going to want to line that up, and once you find that, this being the only deeper divot on this side, once you line that up, the rest of it should fall into place. The valve cover gasket will be flat on one side and pointy on the other side. The flat side actually goes into the groove on the valve cover, and the pointy side will make contact with the head. That's how it seals up. The fact that the flat side goes into the valve cover also allows it to basically get locked in tight so that it doesn't fall once we flip this over onto the engine. Just go around and press it into its groove from one side all the way to another. Make sure it's even and flat. Okay, that's all seated. Let's do the same with the spark plug tube seals. These are also directional. Same deal, the flat side will go on the valve cover side, whereas the pointy side faces up towards you, which means it'll contact the engine. All right, with all those in, let's get the valve cover back on the engine. On the engine side, we also want to clean some things up, especially where the gasket's going to ride. To do that, I recommend a razor blade and very, very gently scrape off any debris that is here. Scrape away from the engine. You don't want to get any of this in the engine. At the back there, it's a little bit challenging to get your hand and your razor blade dip back there, but it is important to clean. If you can't get a razor blade or a scraper or anything, use a rag, wipe it off as clean as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to seal up without any debris in the way so that it, well, doesn't leak. With everything cleaned up, I'm going to take a clean rag, put some brake parts cleaner on it, and now I'm going to wipe off the surface where the gasket will sit, just to get rid of any remaining debris or oils. I'm going to do the same thing on the spark plug tube seals here. On the back of the engine, we need to apply some gasket maker or RTV to the areas that either have a sharp corner like this, or back here where there's a split in the head where there's a cap, so that the gasket can seal up properly. It needs a little bit of help from some extra silicone. You don't need to put a lot. I'm just going to put a little bit over here. Do a very thin layer. As you set that gasket down from the valve cover, it'll squish and go into everywhere where it needs to go. A little dab over here, just on the corner where it's a little sharper of an angle. And then underneath this wiring harness here, we'll do this, but on the other side. I have a clean glove, by the way. I degreased it. I don't want any oils on my glove interfering with the silicone that I'm applying. And what I did on the back side, we actually also have to do on the front. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult because it's right behind this timing cover here. Just a tiny bit. You don't need a lot. If you put too much, it's going to squish, and you don't want it to get inside of the engine. You want it to stay out there. Now you can take your valve cover and let's set it back down onto the engine. Try not to smudge the RTV that you just applied. It will be fairly difficult, not gonna lie. But just like we removed it, we can get this out of the way. Push some of this wiring up and out. Try to get this seated. As you do this, make sure the gasket doesn't come off of the valve cover. It is very important. It is very likely for it to pop off. I can feel it in the back here. Try not to smudge too much of my RTV, but as long as the gasket's still seated, you should be good to go. I'm going to hand start all these bolts. That way I make sure that it's all lined up. All of them are so far starting on perfectly, so I am certain that this valve cover is lined up as it should be. After I start them, I will bottom them out just with a small ratchet to make sure that they're fully threaded in. And then of course we will torque all of these. It is important that you seat the gasket properly, don't over tighten it and don't under tighten it. I'm just gonna get them snug by hand first. All right, they're all bottomed out. Let's grab a torque wrench and torque them in sequence. The torque for these is from the center, working your way to the outer bolts, and it's supposed to have 3 passes, 40 inch-pounds, 80 inch-pounds, and then 105 inch-pounds. 40 inch-pounds is literally just bottomed out and almost barely snug by hand. So I'm pretty sure that I'm already there, having bottomed these out. So considering that, I'm going to skip directly to 80 inch-pounds for my first pass. Like I said, if you want to go around for 40 inch-pounds first, go ahead. But I'm 100% sure that I'm already there, having bottomed them out. So 80 inch-pounds, starting from the center out, here we go. All right, that's all of them. Since I have my torque wrench on this one, because they're already fairly tight, I'm gonna start with this one and we'll go to 105 inch-pounds in a cross pattern. Like I said, they're already tight, just needs one extra step. Okay, 105, here we go. As you can see, from 80 to 105 inch-pounds, it's basically another 1/8 of a turn, so it's really not that much. All right, those are all tight. If you want to go around one more time, go ahead, but I am certain that everything is properly tightened so we can move along. Take this harness and loop it back over the top of the valve cover here. It's got some retainers. There's one on here. There's supposed to be one here, but it's missing, it's broken. So put it back where it belongs. There was a coolant temperature sensor over here. Re-secure the wire onto this timing cover. And several things got plugged in on this side. There was a cam position sensor, wiring harness retainer over here, crank position sensor down here. Don't forget to lock all of the ones that have a lock on them. Oil pressure sensor here. At the back of the engine here, let's re-secure this harness on the two studs that hold down the valve cover. Put that down. And on the other side as well. Just like that. Let's get the ignition coil pack on here and re-secure all the spark plug wires. The coil pack should be numbered with spark plug wires according to their cylinders, but if you left them plugged in, it'll pretty much fall into place exactly how it came off. Before I bolt it on, I'm going to plug it in here. Make sure that connector clicks. Lock it in. Let's get the bolts in. Make sure you press all the spark plug wires down until they click and lock into place. You don't want these popping off when you drive. And with a 10mm socket, snug them all up. If you're doing this by hand, just give them about 1/8 of a turn after they bottom out. That should be good. You don't want to over tighten them and crack the valve cover or the coil. That's mounted. Let's continue. Let's get the intake back on. This procedure might be a little tricky just because of the way that it's mounted here. It's going to be fairly difficult to get everything lined up and back on. First, make sure all of your wires are out of the way when you move the intake in, not to make sure you don't pinch anything, of course. And then you also want to inspect your rubber gaskets, the intake gaskets here. Mine are good. I'm good to reuse them. If yours are flat, crushed, hard, brittle, replace them. You will have a vacuum leak and the engine will not run properly. If they are squishy and pliable and they stick out still, then you're good to go. You are able to reuse them. Having said that, I'm going to bring the intake back in, and the only bolt I can see right off the bat is this first one here, so that's what I'm going to line up first. I'm going to stick a bolt in here, and once this one is started, I should be able to pivot the intake on this bolt up and down to line up the rest of them, and I know that it won't fall back off. Okay, I was able to get this started. I'm going to thread it in most of the way just so it has less wiggle room, and after this, like I said, all I have to do is move it up and down accordingly, pivoting on this bolt. Okay, I got the center one started. This should allow me to get everything else a little bit closer. I got all the hardware started, all 5 bolts. The torque for this is 250 inch-pounds. That converts to 20.8 foot-pounds, so basically you can round it up to 21 foot-pounds. The sequence on this is just starting from the center, working your way to the outer bolts in a cross pattern, basically. So you start here, and then you move along one at a time. And that is so that you can seat the intake manifold correctly and perfectly flat on the engine. I have all the bolts bottomed out. They are not tight. They need to be tightened. And once again, 250 inch-pounds is the torque for these. I'm going to start on the center one, and then we'll work our way towards the outers. Just a side note here, I have not attached the dipstick tube yet. That is a separate bolt. We will put that in later. So this torque spec does not include the torque for this bolt. All right, that's all torqued down. If you want to double check them, go ahead, but I'm sure that these are all tight. Let's continue by mounting the dipstick tube and the fuel line with the evap line bracket. It's got the stud in that holds the bracket for the dipstick tube. Okay, once you have it in, thread it on. This took a 13mm socket. Make it nice and snug. now, on top of this, we need to put the 2 ground cables on. The thicker one should go on first because it's the main battery cable, and you always want the bigger, larger connection first, and then the smaller one that has the 2 wires clamped on or crimped on goes on second. Also, if they're corroded, clean them up. You want there to be a good connection there. And on top of that, put the mounting nut on. Also 13 millimeter in size, snug it up. Once it bottoms out, give it about 1/8 of a turn. You don't want to completely crush those ring terminals, but you do want them to be tightly clamped on there. Let's reattach this bracket with 2 evap lines and the main fuel supply line. Add 2 little 10 millimeter headed bolts. Tighten them up. Once you snug them up, that should be good. They're threading into an insert that is mounted onto the plastic intake, so you don't want to break anything. You just want them tight enough to hold this bracket on. That's it. Let's install this thermostat housing / water neck, whatever you want to call it. And you want to inspect your thermostat gasket. Mine is still in great shape, so I'm going to reuse it. If yours is bad, definitely replace it or you will have a coolant leak. This piece is directional because it's slanted in one direction. So you want to make sure you put it on the same way it came off. It is slanted towards the front of the engine. Start in the 2 bolts that hold it on. Let's thread both of them on completely, bottom them out. And of course we will torque them to spec so that this does not leak. The torque on these 2 bolts is 15 foot-pounds. I know I have to torque the inner one with a swivel, but it is what it is. I have no other choice. Just gonna make sure that swivel stays straight so I can get an accurate torque reading. That's it right there. The torque is fairly low, so I'm not too worried about it. Resecure this wire if you popped it off to get to that bolt, just like that. Let's get the hose on, pinch the clamp, and let's put it back down. I like to set it exactly where it was so it can have the best seal possible. Just like that. Reinstall the PCV hose. Let's remount the throttle body. Make sure you route the cable properly. So it's gotta go underneath the PCV hose here, just like that. And then before I bolt it on, I'm just going to plug in these 2 connectors and lock them in at the same time. And when you plug them in, make sure they click. Now start in the bolts. Of course, check the gasket also and make sure that it's still pliable, soft, and it's not completely squished and collapsed or rock hard. In that case, you would definitely need to replace it or you will have a vacuum leak. This lower one's going to be a little trickier just because it's underneath here. You'll have to use a swivel socket. There we go. Got that one started as well. Let's snug them up, and the torque for these is 105 inch-pounds. Okay, those are all torqued. Let's get the air filter housing back on. Line it up with the throttle body and press it on. Use an 8 millimeter socket and snug up this clamp just enough until you can't pull this off anymore. If you over tighten it, it will strip out the clamp and then you'll need a new one. Okay, that's getting snug. This can't move, so we're good. Now make sure your petcock is fully closed. Don't over tighten it. It is plastic and it's got a rubber seal in here that seals it up, but you want to make sure it's closed. Obviously, when you fill it, you don't want coolant coming out the bottom. Now it's time to fill the cooling system. I have this spill-proof funnel that I installed at the top of the radiator to help me bleed or fill and bleed the system. If you don't have one, that's fine. Just pour it into the radiator. I'm going to add manufacturer specified coolant in here. It's going to bubble for a little bit as the coolant goes into the radiator, air comes out. As soon as it stops bubbling, I'm going to fill this about 1/4 of the way. That gives me an extra bit of coolant here that can go in as needed as the vehicle is running. Now let's start up the engine, make sure everything is running as it should, and we'll wait for it to warm up to bleed the system. Now that the coolant is done bleeding, I'm going to cap this off, squeeze the upper radiator hose, pull my funnel off. There we go. Minimal spillage here. I'm going to put the rest in the overflow tank. Make sure that's full all the way to the full line. I'm going to take off this adapter for my funnel and then put on the radiator cap. Make sure that's seated all the way. It's going to have 2 clicks to it. There we go. There you have it. Take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.